From the mind behind cross-family values and cross-psychopath comes a new entry in extreme horror. Welcome to Ferals by David Lapham. When a chilling murder rocks a small town in Minnesota, a deep mystery unfurls involving the monstrosity known as the werewolf. But these aren't just any old werewolves. These are savage beasts who absolutely decimate their victims. Guttural animals who slice and dice until there's nothing left. So be warned. All that and more is to be found in today's graphic story. Hey guys, how's it hanging? Today we'll be discussing Ferals by writer David Lapham and artist Gabriel Andrade. Right, Ferals was an ongoing series published by Avatar Press, which ran for 18 issues and was collected in 3 volumes. And right now we're going to talk about the first one. If there's interest in continuing on beyond that, I will certainly consider doing so. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can stay in the loop for all kinds of latest video type stuff. Anyway, but enough with all of that, let's just jump right in. If you want to avoid spoilers, go ahead and skip to the review portion of the video. So our story begins in the small Minnesotan town of Cypress. It has a low population of 482 people in it. Well, 481 now. Because, as we can see, there's been some sort of bloody attack, as evidenced by the disembodied hand still gripping a mug on the table. And called on the scene to investigate is our main character, Dale Chestnut. Chestnut here is one of 3 active police officers in the minuscule town, and he is pretty obviously modeled after actor Jensen Ackles. Anyway, so the victim here was a guy named Mark Forrest, and it was his ex-wife, Jackie, who discovered the ghastly scene. Mark was kind of a deadbeat drunk who no one really liked, but he was Chestnut's best friend, and that's why Jackie called him in specifically. Also present is the coroner, Chicker, who can tell that the hand was not cut off with a tool, but was rather instead torn off by something very suddenly. Whatever the case, Chestnut interrogates Jackie, asking what she was even doing at Mark's trailer in the first place, seeing as he was her ex-husband, who she despised. Jackie snaps back and tepidly reveals that she thought Mark was going to be gone, and that she was there to rob him, as she has bills to pay and kids to support. Kids Mark never bothered to visit. Not too long after that, Chestnut and Chicker discovered the mangled corpse of Mark. As you can see, Mark is not in the best condition. He looks like he just drank some Diet Coke, and then ate a Mento. In other words, his limbs are hanging on by a thread, and his insides are on the outside. Also, his dick was cut off and lodged into his throat, cartel style. So needless to say, the perpetrator was likely not an animal, and Chestnut wants everyone in the bar he's drunkenly yelling in to know that fact. He cools off, though, with a game of pool, until Ralph, a fellow officer, points out that a young woman is staring him down. Chestnut goes up to her and introduces himself. Her name is Gerda, and she is very inquisitive about the details of Mark's death. She says that she likes pain, and apparently so, as we cut to Chestnut and Gerda shagging in the bathroom. Ew. Have fun contracting sepsis or whatever. Anyway, Gerda is a real freak, and she wants Chestnut to literally hit her, but he won't until she ends up triggering him into punching her in the face. We cut to a few hours later as Chestnut visits Jackie's house, and he sits out on her porch. Jackie comes out and tells him to come inside. Then they have sex, which I guess they've been doing for a while. The next morning, as Jackie is making breakfast, she hears a strange sound coming from her backyard. But before she can really investigate the matter, she is yanked away by a fucking werewolf. This thing is absolutely massive, and it starts ripping into her. Unfortunately, Jackie's cries fail to rouse the drunken stupor of Chestnut. He only becomes aware of the ongoing situation when Jackie's daughter shakes him awake. He takes out his weapon and starts firing at the werewolf, but it's way too late. Also, take a look at his stupid fucking tattoo. Anyway, Jackie is dead and the werewolf flings Chestnut into a tree before being scared off by the next door neighbors, who are armed. Chestnut wakes up in the hospital in pretty bad shape. He had a punctured lung, 8 broken ribs, and serious internal bleeding, according to his nurse. It is quite surprising he even made it with injuries so severe. But in any case, Chestnut wakes up to the watchful eyes of the sheriff, who informs him that he's been out for 5 days and was helicoptered in to another town's hospital. He then asks Chestnut if he knows a woman by the name of Gerda in Geppertson. Chestnut affirms this to be the case before the sheriff bluntly notifies him that she's in fact dead. You see, the sheriff thinks Chestnut is hella sus, and he in no way believes in the theory that a strange animal is responsible for the killings. I mean, wolves and bears don't typically rip people apart like that, for one thing. But for another, the simple fact of the matter is that one of the victims was Chestnut's best friend, and the other two had a semen inside them. For that reason, the sheriff is not going to let Chestnut go, and he has stationed people outside his room until he can gather enough evidence to definitively prove his case. So needless to say, things aren't looking too good for old Chestnut here, and he knows it. So he makes like a tree and leaves, jumping out the window. Chestnut manages to drive himself in a stolen vehicle to Dr. Chicker, the coroner's house, where he demands to be taken to the icebox where the bodies are located. But before they go, Chicker takes a look at Chestnut's wounds and remarks upon their rapid healing. Whatever the case, the two go to where the bodies are held. They ponder the remains of Jackie, Mark, and Gerda. Chestnut points out that Mark and Gerda are in a noticeably worse and more torn-up shape than Jackie is. Almost like it was personal. Chicker then reveals that there was actually 2 different semen samples extracted from Gerda, which prompts Chestnut to conjecture that it was Mark's, meaning that Mark had previously hooked up with Gerda. Chestnut's working theory now is that the monster's after him because he slept with Gerda, and that Jackie was just an unfortunate casualty, in the wrong place at the wrong time. He supposes that the beast was trained to attack, and Chicker says that maybe it was by her husband, a man named Christopher in Geppertson, who lives up in a town called Bergen. Chestnut and Chicker part ways, and not long after that, Chestnut is discovered by the sheriff and forced into a jail cell. Chestnut pleads with the sheriff and is adamant that Gerda's husband is the one responsible for all the murders. The sheriff tells him that the FBI is on the way, and that Christopher, the husband, had a rock-solid alibi. All of a sudden, they all hear a heavy sound on the roof, and the sheriff calls for backup. There is a brief moment of silence, and the tension is unbearable. Then, all of a sudden, the window shatters as the bloodthirsty werewolf bursts its way into the room. The sheriff is in disbelief and yells at Chestnut to grab his gun out of his pocket. The werewolf pounces upon the sheriff and chomps into his shoulder, pausing only when Chestnut presses the barrel of his gun into its head. The werewolf is smart enough to understand at least some of what Chestnut is doing and saying, so he tells it to put the sheriff on the ground. Chestnut knows it's only really after him, so he tells it to go outside, where they'll settle this, one-on-one. The werewolf don't take kind to that kind of posturing, though. Basically ripping the sheriff's leg off is a giant fuck you. The monster then charges at Chestnut, trying to break into his cell until the man jabs his thumb into the werewolf's eye socket, ripping out the precious organ. The werewolf scampers away in pain, and Chestnut looks down at his hands in great astonishment, realizing that his fingers are now claw-like for some reason. He don't got no time to think about that shit, though, so he picks up his shotgun and gets ready for the final confrontation. Or at least he thinks so, 'cause he's still in an abysmally rough shape, as evidenced by his weird vomiting and the fact that he passes out. The next morning, as the sun slowly rises, a black vehicle pulls into the bereaved town, and out comes 2 smartly dressed FBI agents. The one on the left goes by P, and the one on the right is nicknamed Shoe. The agents begin questioning Ralph, Chestnut's police officer comrade, as to Chestnut's recent behavior. Ralph relays to them the events at the bar with Chestnut and Gerda, and how they hooked up and how she came out with a black eye and all that. However, Ralph also shares with the FBI agents the little detail that Chestnut confided in him that he thought he loved Gerda and was supposed to be with her forever. The agents dismiss Ralph and then rummage around in the bodies of the 3 victims. They are looking for something, and they find it. There is some sort of thing in the uterus of Gerda. We next cut to Chestnut, who is just waking up and regaining consciousness. He is a bit groggy at first, but he finds out that, to his great surprise, he is miraculously fully healed. He feels great, in fact, and he gets back to hunting down the werewolf. And it doesn't take Chestnut long to find it, munching on a little snack by the creek. Lol. Me when someone walks in on me eating the last of the Cheez-Its at 3 a.m. Anyway, they get to battle, and it's pretty savage. The werewolf seems to have the upper hand, knocking the gun out of Chestnut's hands and flinging him around and all that. Chestnut does manage to get his weapon, though, and he fires upon the beast to no avail. The werewolf then chomps on his arm and ragdolls him around some more. Chestnut just barely manages to break free, and with the adrenaline pumping, he launches himself upon the creature's back, where he starts beating it with the butt of his gun. He then gives a final, hearty, fuck you, before shooting the werewolf in the spine, point blank. It's over. Chestnut won. Well, at least this battle, because next he's going after the monster's owner. He's going after Gerda's husband. And speaking of which, the issue ends with that very same man, Christopher, sensing the death of the werewolf, or the Great One as he calls it. Christopher says that it's time to round up the others, so they can put an end to this madness. And the final panel reveals that he too possesses the clawed hands. Issue number 4 of Ferals is a flashback issue that gives some backstory to both Christopher and Gerda and the events leading up to the beginning of the book. Right, so we see the townspeople of Bergen, Minnesota, looking over the strewn-out corpse of a half-naked woman. For reference, by the way, Christopher is the one who is always wearing that black Tim Pool beanie, and Gerda is the one wearing the pendant on her neck. Anyway, it turns out that the deceased here was Gerda's sister, Bridget. Christopher, who is kind of the community leader, I guess, promises Bridget's husband vengeance for her death and tells Gerda to dispose of the body. And so the search for the killer begins. That night, as Gerda and Christopher have dinner with their infant son, they discuss the state of the hunt. Christopher says that he has men following a trail along the river, and Gerda suggests they begin a more thorough search of the woods. The next morning, we see Gerda singing to herself as she trims the fingernails of her son, but this is not any sort of normal domestic affair. The son is strapped down so that his claws don't scratch his mother when she's cutting them. But before that can progress any further, a man bursts into the house. Apparently, he and Gerda have a thing together, and because her husband is busy searching the woods, he just had to see her. Gerda tells him that this is dangerous, and that her husband will kill him if he finds out. And then the dude kind of loses his shit and chokes Gerda out before throwing her into the ground and calling in his entourage. Then Gerda is kind of forced to service all the men. Afterwards, we see Gerda relocating the body of her sister, cursing out the men from earlier. Then we do a brief flashback. A flashback within a flashback, if you will, in order to find out what truly did happen to Bridget. As it turns out, Gerda had led her sister out into the woods under false pretenses in order to isolate her. Gerda is big mad because she caught Christopher, her husband, having sex with Bridget, so her conflict resolution is pretty much just to bash her sister's skull in with a rock. But if that wasn't enough, she is now taking a shovel to Bridget's head so as to decapitate it. She then drags it to the man's house, who she just had relations with. Later on, as she's clipping her son's nails again, Christopher returns with the head of that very same man. Christopher found Bridget's blood at his house, so he thought he was responsible for her death, and so he killed him. But that's not all he found there. He also came upon Gerda's necklace, meaning that the jig is up. They get into an argument and then a physical altercation, all laced with a weird sadomasochistic dynamic that we really don't need to get into. The main thrust of it is that Gerda went along with the sexual encounter with all those men earlier to disgrace her husband when word got out. And those men, minus the one killed, are outside right now, ready to kill Christopher. But Christopher is ready, and he digs out an old bag from which he pulls out a strange horn, much to Gerda's dismay. He then goes outside and confronts the group of men. Christopher takes one out with his claw hands, but he ends up getting stabbed. The men tell him it's over, but Christopher says, not quite. And then all of a sudden the werewolf appears onto the scene and starts wrecking shit. When Christopher finally manages to trudge back home, to his horror, Gerda has escaped and is gone. And what's more, before she left, she stabbed their child to death as a parting gift. So that takes us pretty much up to the present, I guess. Alright, now that we're all caught up, we see Christopher sobbing while driving a truck. He's picked up the werewolf Chestnut killed, and his grief is now giving way to anger. But what is Chestnut up to anyway? Well, he's hanging out at a motel somewhat nearby. He's trying to get used to his strange finger claws, cutting them down for now with a knife. Like Christopher is looking for him out of revenge, Chestnut is looking for Christopher out of revenge. So Chestnut goes to a hunting supply store and purchases a powerful rifle from an older gentleman working there. Then basically, Chestnut berates the old codger into surrendering his car and into telling him where in this small community he can find Christopher and Geppertson. He gets what he wants and revs up the car and starts speeding as fast as he can to his destination. But before he even knows what hit him, Chestnut has ran over a spike strip and flipped the entire vehicle. Needless to say, he's pretty fucked up. And also, needless to say, the person responsible was Christopher himself. To that end, one of Chrissy Boy's goons forcibly removes Chestnut from the wreckage, and they engage in battle. The goon, who shall remain nameless, ends up knocking Chestnut down, and he thinks he has him. But before Christopher can go and get Chestnut chained up in time, the Nutmeister blasts the lackey in the chest with his gun. Then, of course, Chestnut and Christopher confront each other in a sweaty and desperate showdown. They really hate each other, and it's pretty no-holds-barred. Fists fly, blood spurts, and airways are restricted. But as always is the case with such conflicts, someone has to win and someone has to lose. And Christopher, with his finger claws, has essentially partially disemboweled Chestnut, who now deeply regrets cutting his own earlier. And so, Chestnut passes out, and Christopher chains him up. It takes a couple days for Chestnut to wake up, and when he does, it's on the floor of an old barn. He calls out for help, which only serves to alert Christopher to his consciousness. Chestnut is very upset and confused. He has no idea what the fuck is going on, why he has claws now, or why Christopher hasn't killed him yet. Fortunately, though, Christopher has something to show him, and all will be explained in good time. We then catch up with the FBI agents and see what they're up to. Remember, it's P on the left and Shoe on the right. Anyway, they have rolled into town in pursuit of Chestnut, who they figure is in pursuit of Christopher. By pure chance, the two stop at the hunting supply store Chestnut was at earlier, and the FBI guys ask the old guy running it the same question. Where does Christopher live? The old man plays coy for a minute, but the agents aren't having it, and so they throw him around and kick him in the face. Jesus, Buddy has been going through a rough one. In any case, they begin driving to the location, conversing as they do so. Apparently, they are a part of some kind of FBI, monster, or paranormal investigation division. P is skeptical and doesn't actually believe in any of that type of stuff, but Shu, though he's never actually seen a werewolf, has seen an honest-to-God demon possession before, and so is a little bit more open to the concept. But enough with all that. Let's return to Chestnut and Christopher. Chestnut asks what the werewolf has done to him, to which Christopher replies that it actually wasn't the animal. It was actually Gerda that affected him thus. You see, Gerda had this disease, which can be spread through sexual transmission, which is ultimately what was responsible for the enhanced healing, strength, hair growth, and finger claws. The infected, such as they are known as the ferals. Christopher then drags Chestnut to a large open building filled with people standing in a circle around the dead body of the werewolf, and it all clicks for Chestnut. There's some kind of werewolf cult. Christopher affirms this to be the case and says that Chestnut is now a member, whether he likes it or not. Essentially, this werewolf cult goes back to Viking times. It's a sort of pagan religious type deal. Their cult has worshipped the mythological being known by names such as Fenrir or Grendel for over 1,000 years. And Fenrir, or whatever you want to call this spirit thing, only has a corporeal, physical form as the werewolf here for a short amount of time. And to get into that physical form, the cult has to sacrifice one member who has to drink the last werewolf's blood in order to become the next one. Basically, someone has to give up their own life in order for it to be used as an earthly vessel for Fenrir. So, that is why Chestnut is here, why he was kept alive. Rather than sacrifice one of their own community members, Chestnut will be forced to become the next werewolf. Chestnut says if he becomes the monster, he will just kill them all, but Christopher says that he won't have that type of control or independence anymore. So next, the cult collects some of the werewolf's blood in a bucket, and Christopher tells them to hold Chestnut's mouth open. But before that can happen, the FBI agents emerge onto the scene and start shooting motherfuckers. It's absolute carnage, a real massacre. Christopher fights back, though. He slices off Shu's arm and then partially decapitates P, obviously ending the latter. Shu manages to fire off a good shot at Christopher, though, finally putting him down and ending the madness once and for all. Shu thinks he's the only person left alive in the room until he hears a faint voice urging him to shoot them all again, just to make sure they're all really dead. It's Chestnut, who has managed to survive the bloodbath. The bloodied and bullet-ridden Chestnut is incredibly delirious, and the book ends with him telling Gerda that it's okay now. They got them all. And that wraps up the first 6 issues of Ferals. Like I said, there are 12 more issues in the series, and if there is great interest, I could continue, because shit gets wild. But enough with that, let us briefly remark on the art and writing. Right, so I'll begin by discussing Gabriel Andrade's art. In short, I think it fits the series well. It's pretty much what you would expect for a series like this. It makes sense, in other words. The werewolf design itself is pretty good, and I like that it looks like it took a lot of colors and shades to bring the beast to life here, but maybe I just think werewolves look cool, I guess. By the way, as a complete aside, I checked out the werewolves subreddit on Reddit, and apparently it's full of furries for some reason. Yeah, anyway, as it pertains to the art, the panel composition is very straightforward and kind of basic, which is not the end of the world or anything. And in some ways, it kind of makes it more movie-like. But regardless of that, in terms of criticism, the only thing I can think of offhand is that the faces kind of look awkward and a little silly sometimes. But let's move on to the writing, though. Okay, I honestly don't know if there's much to say. Ferals is a quick, fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled story. It is very violence and action-oriented, with very little downtime between the next big sequence. To that end, Ferals is very reminiscent of your standard slasher movie from the 80s or something. And that does that leave you much to think about afterward? Not really. It's just kind of a fun thrill ride. And this is kind of evidenced by this interview I have here with the author, David Lapham. Right, so the interviewer asks David Lapham, do the Ferals represent the animal nature of man? And are you telling a deeper story about the violent tendencies in the human race? And Lapham replies that, no, they're who they are. Their nature is their own and a byproduct of their tradition and condition. They don't represent regular human beings. They might, however, be telling a deeper story of what happens when you stick your nose in other people's business. This is about live and let live. Or die horribly. Fair enough, man. Lapham goes on to distinguish specifically the crossed from the werewolves and the ferals. Right, so instead of crossed representing, the dark potential of humankind or acting as a sort of force of nature, according to Lapham, he wanted to introduce a new type of being, the werewolf, and create a new culture and history behind it with the ferals. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be crime and punishment. It's a fresh take on the werewolf mythos, interspersed with enough intrigue, mystery, and gore to keep you eagerly turning the page. I understand some readers will take issue with the characters, as they're all deliberately rank hypocrites and deeply flawed and unlikable. But that's not something that really matters to me, I guess. I don't really need to identify with certain personalities in order to understand or enjoy a story. Yes, the characters are kind of shallow, but come on, man. What did you really expect going into an NC-17 werewolf comic? Don't get me wrong, though. I'm sure there is enough room for analysis around the character of, Gerda, for example, or room for a discussion about, the writer's inclusion of certain dynamics, so to speak. But it all really ultimately comes down to how seriously you decide to take this book. But that about does it. What did you think of this story? Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe when you're at it. Also, leave suggestions for future content to cover as well. But beyond that, all I can really say is thank you for watching. I hope you have a good one.